Hawthorn 4-0 to start the season as the AFL's round 3 concludes. The Socceroos one step closer to North American World Cup qualification. And once again, what is going on with South Melbourne? This is Sportswatch. Hello everybody, welcome back to Sportswatch here on Six News. I am not Lachlan Sheriff, he is away sick, and somehow 7 episodes in I'm filling it again. This time Tin Nguyen is here with us. Tin, always good to chat.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be as always.
Yeah, so if you notice the absence, I mean, the Prime Minister was on Six News last week and there was an election called, but that stuff happens. But we will be here throughout the federal election campaign somehow. Trust me, somehow it's gonna keep rolling on, and there is plenty to talk about. And we Shezza as well, were at the NPL in Victoria last night, so we'll start with that. South Melbourne, Dandenong City winning 1-3. A pretty comprehensive victory in the end, I thought. Dandenong City got on the score sheet pretty early in the first half. South Melbourne were able to get one back reasonably soon, but then Dandenong City, I mean, there was one goal where there wasn't a goalkeeper from South. I mean, at the end, it was almost a bit too easy. What did you make of that performance?
I mean, yeah, last night I think was just, it was part of the culmination of just, it must be a difficult stretch for the South Melbourne now. I think it's 6 games now without a win, and it's just, it has not been good viewing at Lakeside. It's not been good viewing anywhere you look, for the South Melbourne. I mean, they didn't start the season too horribly. You could, as always, they probably jump into almost every season as, comprehensive favourites. But I think for the first time in a while, we're looking at a South Melbourne team who, they've almost been caught out by the rest of the league. And I mean, yeah, they've had difficult stretches, especially with injuries. But, there's been questions around things like, squad selection and substitutions, which, maybe you can question, why wasn't George Mells given a run last night when, younger players were, there's all this experience and on the bench, and it's stuff that kind of just confuses the mind of most average people watching. I mean, yeah, look, last night they weren't out of it for the longest time, but you can see towards the end of the second half, the drop off that South Melbourne had was just something that's been a common theme through most of the season. You think back to that game against St Albans, where even with a rotated squad, it all just fell apart. You think back to the derby against Big Show against Preston Lions. You think back to the game against Dandenong Thunder. It's starting to become a common recurring theme, and at some point, someone's going to have to take responsibility for it for sure.
Yeah, so the most recent South Melbourne games, you mentioned it, but I think it's worth going through. So they had it's actually more than a month now. They had a home victory against Melbourne Knights. Were we at that one? I don't remember. I think we were. Maybe. And
Yes, we
that
were.
was, yeah, we were. So that was a 3-1 win. But since then, it was a 3-3 draw to Melbourne victory under 21s, a 0-3 loss to St Albans, 2-0 loss to Preston, 1-0 loss to Dandenong Thunder, 1-1 draw to Hume City, and then as we just had a 1-3 loss to Dandenong City. Now, South Melbourne is, I think, completely fairly, right, held up as kind of the pinnacle of NPL Victoria, right? They've always been this ginormous club. You can tell that through their fans who are absolutely passionate, which is, fair enough. And they've got this huge opportunity in just a few months, right, with the Australian Championship. They're obviously pushing to eventually become a top flight club once, systems are worked out. And that's a much bigger conversation that can be had. But, their participation in the Australian Championship is locked in. There's literally no doubt about it. They're locked in. Half of the clubs are locked in. They're one of that half. If they end up low on the NPL Victoria ladder, or God forbid, in a relegation spot as well. Like if they're genuinely relegated from NPL Victoria, and then they're still just essentially getting rewarded with the Australian Championship, I think, is that fair to annoy some other clubs who might be missing out on a spot in Victoria?
I mean, questions will have to be asked. Questions will be asked for sure. I mean, the championship, of course, has for years been the answer to what has been the missing link between the A League and the rest of the system. It's meant to be a merit-based competition, and for the last couple of years, you can't take away from South Melbourne's history, you can't take away from their fan base, you can't take away from the expectations and of course the merit that this club has had for the last couple of years. They're an incredibly huge club. That's the facts that can't be taken away from them. But of course, if they're not doing too great this season, and they've been given this free pass into the championship, when teams like Dandenong Thunder have basically flipped their seasons around. Teams like, Hume City and Dandenong City, who have been, constantly pressing, the outside of finals for the longest time in NPL Victoria. I mean, look, they won't lose the spot. That's the truth. The FA would be stupid to get rid of a club like South Melbourne, especially in a competition like the Championship that needs big historic clubs like South. But ultimately, there will be a lot of questions around it, especially if they end up low on that table in the relegation spot. Even if they just survive relegation, ultimately, if they're not fighting for finals, you could argue that that's not good enough for the club, especially with the weighty expectations and the weighty the expectations that not just their fans, but the rest of Australian football and Victorian football likely demands from them.
Yeah, and look, I mean, again, for all we know, South Melbourne can turn it around. It's still relatively early in the season, right? No one's ruling them out. But when you end a round with them one off relegation, one spot off, I mean, that's just it just looks so weird. And you think this isn't where you're supposed to be as we're almost getting to like 10 rounds in to the regular season. And so, look, we'll see if they turn it around. Maybe they're just getting ready to lock in for the championship, which, I kind of understand. But again, we'll have to wait and see because understandably, it's going to annoy a lot of their fans, and they again have a very, very strong supporter base. So I'm sure, and I think to be fair, I think we definitely heard it last night. Are asking for a lot more at the moment, and so look, we'll see if they're able to deliver that. Shame though, that was the last Monday night South Melbourne home game, which is a shame. I've been actually really enjoying those games. I've had nothing better to do on Monday. So 5 p.m. Sunday it is, and I'm sure we'll try to get down to some more NPL games, and I know you and Sheza will be a lot. Speaking of NPL, I just want to take a look at some of the national ladders, and we've had all comps really starting now. In some of the bigger competitions, NWS Spirit is still leading up there in New South Wales, and down at the bottom you have actually you've got all the A-League under 23 sides. Sydney FC's 14th, and then in relegation areas, you've got Central Coast Mariners and Western Sydney Wanderers. For Queensland, which has been very disrupted, and sport in Queensland has still been, extremely disrupted, even in the past week with some of the wet weather. Gold Coast Knights have been leading there. Towards the bottom, you have Brisbane Roar and Brisbane City. But again, it's a very kind of weird spot for Queensland at the moment, which is a shame for them. Interesting, that some of these under 23 and under 21 sides haven't been doing well. Just broadly, and I know their participation is different. How have you observed how they've been going? And also tied into that because Western United, they're not in the NPL, but they're one down in the VPL.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Of course, when you talk about these top flight NPL leagues, especially Victoria and New South Wales, which is such ridiculously high standards of football, even for semi-pro standards. I mean, obviously, it's always difficult for these early academies. They've always struggled, especially playing in the top flight of state football. I mean, it's victory struggling was something that almost everyone saw coming. But yeah, I think it's interesting, especially when you look in New South Wales. That I mean, the entire bottom three is occupied by the two Sydney teams and Mariners. I mean, yeah, you could argue that, of course, here in New South Wales, it's an extremely difficult standard. There's some really big clubs there. Maybe you could argue that some of them should be doing a lot better, especially, teams like Sydney FC and Wanderers who've, prided themselves on such strong youth setups. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think for these academies, results aren't really something that matters for them. It's mostly more about game time and development. And I think in NPL, it's something that they're definitely getting. But yeah, I mean, that's ultimately why teams need to play NPL, especially the academy teams. If they're good enough, again, it's down to the merit, then they deserve to be there. So, I mean, you mentioned my Western United, who are in the VPL one, there's just the typical like NPL Victoria. I mean, for most standards, they've been flying, and as have Melbourne City in VPL one. And ultimately, if they're good enough, they will play in NPL Victoria next year. Will they be as successful or more successful than Victory? Time will tell. I mean, Western and City are both very, very good youth academies, but I mean, at the end of the day, results don't matter, but more so that results probably aren't at the forefront of why those academies are run. But ultimately, yeah, results are the most important thing. They want to win. They want to get these results, and maybe one day we'll see an A-League academy win the NPL in our lifetimes. But ultimately, it's not really something that's of concern to most of these teams, to be honest.
Do you think though, just quickly, and again, maybe it's not so much for Victory who are already in the top state comp, but surely Western United would be wanting to face the strongest NPL teams, and thus get promotion through that rather than VPL, which is again there's some very very strong clubs in the VPL, but clearly when you look at some of the bottom clubs at the moment, that's a significant step down from even like mid-tier NPL clubs.
I mean, yes, of course. I mean, if you think back to that development point of view, it's very beneficial for these, young professional footballers or young aspiring professional footballers to be playing against, basically grown men. That's always been the benefit of the A League clubs playing in this compared to the old Y League system that was adopted in even the 90s under the NSL. Uh, yeah, ultimately, look, the goal is always going to be promotion. The goal is always going to be success. If Western or City and if Victoria are playing in, the flight of Victoria, then ultimately their players are getting exposed to the best footballers in the state, including them. And ultimately, that's better for football in Australia because we want our best upcoming footballers to be playing the best football. We want our best upcoming players to be playing the most football. And that's what NPL provides, especially in Victoria and in New South Wales, where they could play, they can not only play, these strong teams like, your powerhouses like your Avondales, your South Melbournes, your Leichhardts, your Marconis, but also play against big crowds as well. Stuff like, your Sydney United, your South Melbourne, your Preston Lions, it's good for it's good for these players to, just be getting all the experience they can and in a league that is still very comfortably a very strong league, even if there is a reasonable step up to the professional A League.
Yeah, and by the way, just quickly before we move on from the NPL, I'll be remiss if I didn't also look at another very strong club in terms of their results. And after the big game against South, Preston Lions have been a bit shaky. Three losses, one to Avondale, which was 3-1, one at home to Oakley that was 2-3, and one to Port Melbourne, which was 3-2. And that Port Melbourne one was a stoppage time win for Port Melbourne. So we'll see how Preston goes, but focus is on South because it's been more than a month without a win. But we will certainly see how that goes. Speaking of the football, and we'll keep on the round ball game, and we want to get into the A League. First episode of this show, everyone was talking about how good Auckland FC is. They're still very, very, very good. They're currently on top, and then it's followed by all three Victorian clubs. You've got Western United, you've got City, and then you've got Victory. How have you been observing how the finals are shaping up at the moment as we really get into the tail end stage? 21 matches played at the moment for most clubs.
Yeah, the A League is starting to get extremely close. Of course, Auckland leading the way as always. They've probably set the standard all year, and it's looking like they're going to run away with that premiership plate at the moment. To be honest, yeah, of course. You mentioned all three Victorian clubs there, chasing second, chasing that spot in Asia. You could argue Wanderers and Adelaide there. Sydney FC not far behind either, but yeah, no, I think right now basically everyone from Western down to about even arguably MacArthur could potentially shuffle around. I think right now nothing is certain in the A League. Nothing is ever certain in the A League, to tell the truth. But I mean, yeah, right now it's looking to be sensational. They'll finish the season. We've got 5 games to go for most teams, 4 games to go for Victory, and probably some others as well. There'll be some buys there and about. But yeah, I mean, it's looking like there's going to be an incredible finish to the season, especially with teams fighting for that spot in Asia, since obviously Auckland aren't eligible.
Now, I think last time I was co-hosting this, I brought it up with Sheza, and I think it's an important point. And it was the week that MacArthur's captain, Jermaine, quit. And they're still in a bit of trouble at the moment. They're currently eighth. And I think what we said at the time was if they miss out, this could be the deciding factor. Now that they're eighth, now that we're about 5 weeks later from that, um, what do you reckon? Is that almost nail in a coffin for them?
I mean, I can't imagine it's the nail in the coffin. The last thing the A-League needs is to lose more football clubs, to lose the club, especially coming in a period where, you know, it's tumultuous enough in Australian football. But look, it's not ideal for them. It's obviously very not ideal. Results haven't been that great for Reading, but I mean, you still look back to the win against Adelaide a couple of weeks back, just before the international break. That was a pretty fairly solid result. I don't think the lights are out on them, especially yet. Especially they've got Brisbane this week, they've got Mariners the week after. I wouldn't especially cut the lights out for McCarthy yet, but I
Oh,
mean, yeah, it's not great
definitely
viewing.
they're
Obviously,
not.
it's
Definitely, I don't think they're folding. But in terms of their finals chances, I mean, Sydney FC and look, Sydney's had very mixed results this year. That's literally why they're sitting seventh. But it just seems it's very tight for them to get into. And just mind you, on terms of points, right? Sixth currently in terms of Adelaide United, they're on 33. Then eighth, that's just two spots down. They're 29, and you think, okay, it's 4 points, but that does still make a very significant difference if you get to the end and if both sides maintain their current trajectory.
yeah, of course. I mean, you could argue that Adelaide haven't been on their great string of results either in recent weeks, but look, yeah, ultimately, I think at the end of the day, whoever picks up the most points at the end will win, will get to that final spot. I think arguably Adelaide probably the better squad on paper, especially compared to MacArthur. They've been a little more stable on paper, on the field. Off the field, we'll talk about that later, especially with Calvert. But yeah, I mean, right now, I still don't think that it's completely over for them. Because I mean that middle part of the table has been completely like just swapping around almost every week. So I think realistically, the mid-table and almost the entire top half of the table still has heaps of potential to shuffle around, and ultimately, I think the makeup of finals could almost be completely different to how it is now.
Just very quickly, one more thing on the round ball game. The Socceroos, they're very close to locking in that World Cup qualification. How have they been going?
I mean, yeah, in the last international window, we've been nothing short of incredible, to be honest. A huge demolition of Indonesia in front of our home crowd in Sydney. Well, arguably our home crowd in Sydney. It's a discussion for another time. And I mean, there's no way to really twist it. It was an incredible performance. There's no way to sugarcoat it, no way to sell it short. It's just, we played tough opposition that were just as hungry to push for a spot. I mean, the Southeast Asian teams have always been incredibly difficult to play in World Cup qualifying. They've always been incredibly defensive teams, incredibly feisty teams, scrappy teams, that sort of thing. And especially, home with, I mean, in a big Indonesian community as well. Obviously, the crowd was there was a very large representation from the Indonesian support in Sydney. But ultimately, when you look at it, yeah, Australia were just too good for them in the end. Irvine with a double was just incredible. It was an incredible result for Australia, all things considered. And then the week after, they backed it up. They went to China. I think it was 50,000, 60,000, something like that in Guangzhou. And again, yeah, no complaints. A solid 2-0 win. There was never really any point where Australia really looked uncomfortable during these two games. And you could argue that Tony Popovich's new system is starting to take shape for the Socceroos, and we're starting to see the result of that.
Yeah, and I think obviously you want the new system to be noticed, right? You don't want it to be, meet the new boss same as the last boss, right? It has to be some difference, and I think that was very evident in the game against Indonesia, right? That was solid. There was no real moment watching that where I felt particularly concerned. I mean, it was just easy watching, and that's largely what you want. Again, Indonesia isn't like, and look, we Australia faces some respectfully low level clubs in the international window, but I mean, Indonesia, as you said, right, these Southeast Asian clubs are good and they're competitive, but this wasn't a very competitive game. But look, we'll take the win, we move on, and we look forward to the World Cup conscious of time here, I want to get into the other ball game, the Australian Football League, Aussie rules, and we'll get into the AFL. I am very, very happy with Hawthorn. I'm not sure if anyone's noticed that. I'm in a great mood at the moment. 4-0 to start the season. And yes, opening round and all that. Who cares? Very, very strong. GWS, right? Started awfully in the wind against some pretty horrible conditions. And if you watch the broadcast, you could see it. And then just utterly demolished by the end of it. Yes, it got close to the end, but we were strong. We were very strong that whole game, I thought, especially in the third quarter when, again, the wind wasn't in our favour. And look, I could go on about this for a while. Adelaide and Brisbane are following. I had Adelaide missing finals, so we'll see whether that comes out even worse prediction wise. But also up there, Gold Coast. Now, Gold Coast has played 2 games. Granted, again, they weren't up against Brisbane or something or Adelaide, but could this be the year? Could this be the year they actually make finals?
I mean, I think reasonably, Gold Coast have been nothing short of pretty impressive, to be honest. I mean, obviously it was a pretty comprehensive win against Melbourne last week, and the win against West Coast was pretty strong as well. I mean, I'd say that they're a pretty reasonable shout. We're starting to see it come together. I think for Gold Coast, obviously it's been a lot longer than everyone else would like to prefer. Obviously, you talk about GWS, who've already made a grand final in the time since, but I think Gold Coast have looked entertaining to watch so far this year. Obviously, like you said, obviously they're playing teams like Melbourne and West Coast who won't be there ultimately at the end of the season, arguably. But no, I think they've looked like a proper AFL team, and I think this is a year. It's starting to come together for them for sure. I mean, look, make finals at the end of the year. Probably too early to call. They've played 2 games, which is 2 games less than most teams, 1 game less than almost everyone else. It's a weird spot for them, but ultimately, I think there's not much you can take away from the Suns at the moment in terms of how they've played. I mean, they've looked very good on the ball.
On the other side of things, and we'll skip over one of the bottom clubs for your sake. But Richmond, I know Richmond's had a win, but well, I said we skip over it. I mean, that was not very good. But Melbourne and West Coast. Now, West Coast. I thought they'd win against Freo. I thought, they were close against Brisbane, and Freo kind of suck at the moment. And maybe they're going to get this inspired, Derby number 60 win, and wouldn't that be great? And then they just completely sucked. I mean, that was really awful viewing, for what was the only game on at the time. Nevertheless, I think Melbourne. I don't know what Melbourne's doing. They've got Essendon next. It's been, again, just rough watching. And look, I know in some level it's kind of, some things are unfair because of the side the broadcast camera's on and some photos, but also their crowd numbers. And we talk about A-League crowd numbers and everyone laughs at that. But at the MCG, when you only have 23,000 people, it's a lot more noticeable how bad it is. It's just not very good viewing, is it?
I mean, it's a discussion that's been had for a long time for a lot of clubs, but especially for Melbourne. I mean, yes, you can argue there's the tradition. It's the Melbourne Football Club. It's the subdivision of the Melbourne Cricket Club who play the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Yeah. Look, I mean, their low points you can always tell. I mean, it never looks great, especially not at the MCG. I mean, a crowd of 20,000 at the MCG will always look horrible. That's the truth. It's a cauldron. It's a massive ground. It's something that really can only be appreciated when it's almost halfway full, or even arguably nearly full. But yeah, no, it's not a great look for them. Obviously, people will talk about the alternatives. Send them off to Marvel to play their games, and look, maybe you could make that case against tradition, and send them to the ground where they arguably look better. But ultimately, yeah, look, do the crowds affect the results that much? I probably don't think so, but yeah, you could agree. If for a club that's arguably, for a club that's carrying, the name of the city, for a club that's meant to be, a sort of a big historic club, it's not really something that's ideal of a look for Melbourne.
Mm. And look, I'll be fair to them. They have been playing Gold Coast and GWS at the MCG, which are never going to bring in giant crowds. And look, I don't think they should be booted from Marvel. And for the sake of competitiveness, I somewhat hope they're better, and I hope fans turn up. But yeah, it's just been kind of an ugly look. And given this thing is about to end on us, this call in a second, it's just also mentioning some of the footy state leagues have been up and running the VFL in particular. Box Hill's doing nicely in that. And then the Northern Bullets, early stages at the bottom, but very strong and competitive performance against Geelong in Geelong. I've got to say, I mean, you asked me, just over a year ago if I was ever going to take a V line to see a Northern Bullets game. I'd probably say I'd watch it at home. But it's all worth it. It's all for the love of the game, isn't it? That is where we will wrap up Sportswatch, though. We hope Shezza is feeling better and he will be back next week. But Tin, it's always great to chat, and there's a lot more football action in all codes coming your way over the next few weeks, which we will keep covering. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and Tin, it's always great to chat.